Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Applying Ethology webinar. I am Laura Whalen, and together with Jen Chow, Kristen Nowroth, and Sebastian Gramon, we organize these webinars in the Animal Welfare Slack workspace. As we begin today, I want to remind you all to please turn off your camera and microphone. Should you have questions for our speaker, please type them into the chat box, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. It is my pleasure to introduce Jes Harfeld, and an associate professor from Aalborg University. Jes focuses on environmental and animal philosophy and philosophy of healthcare and medicine. Jes is very interested in the ethical problems arising from human interactions with the non-human world. Today, Jes will guide us through European history to better understand how we have come to conceptualize animal welfare. Welcome, Jes.
Thank you very much, Laura. And also welcome to all of you. From me, I'm so happy to see so many people who showed up to this, in many ways, sort of very narrow, but also very broad topic. And I hope that I can restrain myself, even though I'm a philosopher and we have a little bit of a problem restraining ourselves when we start talking, but I will try and keep it to the allotted 20-30 minutes to start with, and then hopefully we'll have some time for some good Q&A after that. As Laura said, I am, or was at least, primarily an animal ethicist. So I kind of started out what I now think is sort of backways, or from the wrong angle or something, many years ago, working on animal ethics. And I'm getting more and more interested in animal welfare science. I've always been interested in animal welfare science, but I'm getting interested in it mainly from what I today call a conceptual history angle. And this is what you people are going to hear about today. I'm going to try and say something about where we got this idea of animal welfare from. And spoiler alert, I'm going to start way back with the ancient Egyptians, but really my story doesn't take off until 1926. So, but bear with me, even though it's going to be some old papyruses to begin with. Okay, I'm going to sometimes look to the left. That's because my screen with my slides is on the left. And I'm going to see if I can... yeah, like that. So, but why should animal behavior scientists and applied behavior and animal welfare scientists be interested in concepts and their history? Well, that's actually a very good question. And for most of your jobs, I don't think it's really that important. But in more general terms, I think it might be still important for some of you in a stronger degree than others, and also in general for the science, animal welfare science community. And that's because the concepts that we use also in natural science are all part of the way that we formulate both the questions and the answers that we have when we do any type of scientific inquiry. And that in that way, our concepts become part of the limitations and the extensions of what type of science and what kinds of questions that we ask. So just in that way, it's kind of important. And concepts are born, they And I'm back, I believe. I'm sorry about that. For some reason that I am not aware of, I didn't touch anything. I kind of went away for a moment there.
That's
I'm
quite
going
okay.
to
We're
try
glad you're
and
back.
reshare my slides, and we'll be up and running again in just a moment.
Perfect. The screen looks great, Jess.
There we go. So, Laura, can I just have you say that you can hear and see everything?
I can hear and see everything. Yes, that looks perfect. You're good to go, Jess.
For some reason, Laura, I cannot hear you. I'm going to try and switch to a different speaker. Okay, good. Laura says I'm good to go, so I will keep talking. I hope that you guys can hear me. Yeah, so I was just trying to reiterate why it might actually be a good idea for hardcore animal scientists to have conceptual awareness in their work, and it's not common to actually use in my field almost biologically sounding words or phrases talking about concepts, because they are to some extent born, or they start to exist at least. They change, they might even be said to evolve to some extent, and sometimes they die. Sometimes we stop using a certain word that carries a fairly significant concept, but it might for some reason just stop being used at all. So it dies, basically. What is very important is that this type of change that we see with concepts, and even their birth also, is connected to a number of different things. It's connected, of course, to people trying to work with the concepts themselves, but it's also connected to people using the concepts without wanting really to work with the concepts themselves, but they're having a praxis, a way of doing something that involves the concept. So if you, as an animal scientist, use the concept of animal welfare, you are in some extent, minor or major, playing into this almost dialectical, to be using a weird phrase, play that creates and recreates this concepts and basically helps turn it in one way or another. And by being aware of this, by being aware of the history and the way the concepts move through time, I think that it would be beneficial both for science and what I think many of us also has as another kind of value. It would be beneficial for animals if we were more aware about the creation and recreation of the concept of animal welfare. So that's why. So if you by now thinking that doesn't sound anything like what I think, and I think this sounds implausible of it, I don't think you will enjoy much of the rest of the talk. So as I kind of promised or warned you about, I'm going to start with the ancient Egyptians and a papyrus. One of the most interesting papyruses that we have from ancient Egypt is something called the Rind mathematical papyrus. And it's very interesting because it's actually or at least we think it's a sort of calculus book, right? It's a book or papyrus in this case, because they didn't have books, that is meant to be a way of practicing math, probably for civil servants working for the administration in the Egyptian kingdom. But it includes many different examples, and even though math is interesting. I've heard from mathematicians that it's interesting historically to know about math in that era. For the rest of us, it's really interesting that they use certain very clear and probably must be very normal examples in their mathematical examples. So that's interesting for us to know about what's happening, and especially for us working with animals. We know that the mathematical papyruses here talk about all kinds of things about geese being fed in certain ways, geese probably being force-fed, kept free range, kept in cages, and they have this structure around agriculture. And we know again that from other sources that the agricultural the fairly sophisticated agricultural practices, animal agricultural practices of the ancient Egyptians also included ideas about animals thriving, and in what ways did animals in agriculture thrive. So we know that this is, of course, as old. The idea of animal welfare is not a new thing. The idea that animals in our care, in our agricultural production systems, which it was also in the Egyptian time, can fare well or not, that is obviously from the get-go a matter for farmers and administration. So there's nothing new in that, but no animal welfare as we know it in that context. The first real writings, or substantial writings anyway, that we have about animal welfare, again, not the right term to use in this concept, but animal thriving or animal cognition, things like that, are from the ancient Greeks. And the philosophers who at that time were not the type of philosophers that we have today, the little group of philosophers that I am a part of today, we have a very, very tiny bit of the disciplinary arena that was the philosophers of the 300 and 400s BC. These people were biologists. Aristotle, as many of you know, is one of the primary fathers of biology. And there were astronomers, there were many things. But they also looked into this idea of animals somehow not only, and it was not only ethics, but it was also an idea about welfare, about animals doing well or not doing well. And this comes in fairly early. We have it from a number of sources. Pythagoras probably, we don't know if Pythagoras himself was, but he's certainly by the later writers been one of the people that has been kind of nominated as an animal welfare philosopher from that time. And this is a common thread throughout the Middle Ages. We see it in the Christian literature, but also in the Arab literature. I'm currently looking at Al-Razi, an Arabian scholar from the 800s, 900s, and for example, who also, when talking about pain, and he's actually kind of working this out from an Islamic point of view, and drawing the conclusion that we ought never to cause pain to anything capable of sensation. And by that he means animals. So the idea of animal having sensation is in here. That in itself is not animal welfare, but he then goes on to talk about cases of using animals of burden, so horses or oxen drawing carrots or something, as in a good way, that there are ways we can use animals, and then there are ways we cannot use animals, that is misuse, too much use. And in that, you can probably see it already, is an idea of animal welfare. So there is actually, it's not a dichotomy, you cannot use animals. No, it's a matter of using animals in a right way, what we would probably identify as a way in which the animals have good welfare. So this goes throughout the Middle Ages, both in the Arabic world, in the Arab world, and in the similar things going on in the Christian Western Northern Europe, and that continues really throughout the Middle Ages. And the first time we see something kind of changing is with the Enlightenment and the 18th century thinkers. And many are used in that context. My favorite, of course, is a Danish philosopher. This is Frederik Christian Eilskov, the Danish philosopher. He was a student of Holberg, if anyone knows who Ludwig Holberg was, and was like, he was basically the James Dean of Danish philosophy in the 1700s. He dies at 25, but was immensely popular and influential. And he has this wonderful book called Philosophical Letters, in which, for example, he tries to do a sort of animal welfare science thing where he says, well, animals talk to us, and he has musical notations, and we don't know how he got these or what the methods behind these are, but he got musical notations of pigs saying or sounding happy and pigs sounding or saying that they are unhappy. And this is, of course, suddenly very close to some of the recent studies in pig welfare that I've seen, much more sophisticated, of course, and with methods that are much more likely to be accepted by peer reviewers when they are published. But there are some of the same things here, and this is an expanding notion in the 18th century, and it's also in the 18th century we get the philosophers really going for this. We get Jeremy Bentham, that some of you know, and in 19th century John Stuart Mill and others who look at animal welfare in an entirely different way, breaks away from anything having to be coming out of the Bible or out of the Quran, but animal welfare for the animals themselves. So, animal welfare, the concept, is born. And it is born into the around the turn of the century, between the 1800s and 1900s, and it is born into animal welfare NGOs, animal welfare associations. So it is related to animal protection societies. As many of you might know, there was a bloom of animal protection societies in the mid to late 1800s, both in Denmark and in England, the Royal Society for the Protection of Animals and all these. They came into existence in the middle of the 19th century to the end of the 19th century. And a number of the smaller branches of that start talking about animal welfare. So it's a concept that is actually in its accidental birth, and we can talk about accidental versus a more non-accidental birth, comes in by NGO. So it's associated with activism and public morality from the beginning, but concepts such as cruelty and suffering, which are the old concepts, are still prevalent. It's not a lot of literature on that where they talk about animal welfare. It's mainly cruelty and suffering that plays a role as the concepts that we navigate in when talking about animals. However, this is where Charles Wesley Hume comes in. Charles Wesley Hume was a physics-educated man from England who became the founder of the University of London Animal Welfare Society, what we today know as UFAW, the Universities Federation for Animal Welfare. And my claim is really that he invented it. He invented together with many others, but he was the hub of this, the modern concept of scientific animal welfare, or at least made it very popular. And the interesting thing is that he does this out of an idea of ethics, I think. So he starts, like I did, with ethics and goes toward animal welfare. So he has this idea, as I quoted, that charity is indivisible. that there is no concept that the charity is something that goes both for animals and humans. He's not an animal scientist himself. That's important to understand as well. And he starts constructing this society. Their first meeting, as far as I can see in the notes about it, 1 or 2 people showed up. So the UFAW that we know today as an amazing society with many members, 2 people showed up on the first day. So it had a hard start, but it got somewhere, as we can see. But when they were starting it, they used this welfare society thing. This was known from other NGOs. They talked about cruelty to animals. They cooperated with the Royal Society. It was about public opinion and about legislation. In many ways, they just looked like they were going to be another animal activist NGO. It could have been, but for Charles Wesley Hume's different idea about it. And his idea was, no, it should not be activism in that way. So he was very, very interested to begin with that he did not want to have the organization, as he called it, captured by cranks, so people who are nuts, and used by anti-vivisectionists, like people who didn't want animal experiments. Same, Dr. Paul Haas, who was one of the founding members, wrote that he was really worried that there might be misunderstandings of the real significance and the mistaken idea that it was composed of soft-hearted idealists. So they wanted to avoid a certain type of activism. So it's an activist start, but avoiding a certain type of activism. And then university science. They wanted, Charles Wesley Hume and the group around him wanted to couple this idea that they had about animal welfare and the activism for animals, really, to university science, and really do it tight. I quote here: UFAW's idea is that the right relations between man and his fellow creatures are a proper subject for the attention of university people as such, and should be studied in the same objective way as any of the topics that feature in a university curriculum. So from the very beginning, it was about reaching out to animal scientists. One of them is, for example, Julian Huxley, a fairly famous person both now and in his time in the arena of zoology, and he was an early member and a part of the beginning of this, and they did that. However, and that's very important, this is also, and to a less extent, this is written, but you can find it between the lines. They were also very much opposed to a certain type of university academic science on this topic, namely behaviorism, or strong behaviorism and positivism. So that the idea from the 1910s, 20s, and 30s that animal welfare was not really a subject worth of studying because all we could know was the things that we could see, the behavior. So they were very much against Pavlovian types of animal science. So it was a certain type of science that they wanted to. Why then? Why did he do this? Well, as I already kind of hinted at, it comes out of ethics. And in Beast and Man, or Man and Beast, he clearly states this. But I've also been able to find in the British Museum, deep in the archives, some earlier works by him or an earlier work from 1913, where he already starts talking about animal ethics in a certain way that is almost to philosophers' ears recognizable as as some type of animal welfare ethics. And of course, this is something that he's not studying to become, but it's part of the very broad study you did at a university in the beginning of the 20th century in the United States, in the United Kingdom. So where are we going with this? Well, I did a very unscientific review of the concept animal welfare, and it didn't take off. like straight into the air after Charles Wesley Hume did. It has taken a long time for the concept of animal welfare to kind of get a grip on the scientific community. So not only is it young in the way that it's less than 100 years old, if I'm right, in the way that it's used today and directly coming from us to us from UFAW, but in its real use, right? So the very first ones between 1900 and 1940, the mentionings of animal welfare is related to UFAW, right? And then only later comes a few more. And then, of course, it explodes after the 1980s, and especially today, and it just keeps going up. So in that way, it's not just young as in less than 100 years, really as a fairly predominantly used concept, it's only from the 80s and 90s. I am older than the concept of animal welfare in this context. So, conclusions. Sorry about that, took a little longer than I had hoped. So, it's a young concept. It has strong, at least within the Anglo-American biased roots. It has a strong connection to UFAW, I think. Animal welfare science is historically and perhaps inherently connected with types of animal ethics and types of animal activism. He talks about indivisible charity, so it's welfare ethics. There's very little talk about indivisible justice, so it's not what we call a deontology. It's not a matter of rights for the animals, really. However, animal welfare as a scientific concept was created within a framework that is clearly an animal use framework. So remember that. So it's born with an animal use concept in it. It's only very, very recently that we've been talking about animal welfare of wild animals. So it's born into servitude to a certain extent. It's continuously created and recreated, as I mentioned earlier, and you all partake. I don't know if all of you here on the Zoom do, but all of you who are animal scientists to any extent do partake in this. All you who do animal welfare science partake in the creation and recreation of the concepts that you use. And since animal welfare might be a concept that you use from time to time, then you are part of the creation and recreation of it. That means that you are also part of the creation and recreations of its new elements, whether it be positive animal welfare, wild animal welfare, one welfare, or something like that. And at the end, I just want to thank my Dr. Mutter, from way back, or who's also my friend today, Birte Lindstrøm Nielsen, for hosting me while I visited the archives at UFAW in the old school at Hampstead, and also to Liz Carter at UFAW for helping me navigate those immense archives. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jes. Can you hear me?
I can hear you very well.
Okay, wonderful. There are some questions starting to come in, and welcome others to keep entering questions into the chat. But if it's okay with you, I have one to get us started. On this idea of creation and recreation that you mentioned at the end, you summarized the animal care perspectives of one of the thinkers from the Arab world, and I'm not going to say his name well, but Abu Bakr al-Razi, as use of animals is acceptable and misuse is not.
Yeah.
And this seems to be a still present, if not dominated, question in some areas. And of course, we could think about abolition, like the abolition of animal use, but I wonder what you think about the word misuse. Do you think the definition of misuse has changed over the years?
Not terribly much, no. That's why I brought him in. I think actually the way that we are considering these things today are very much like a number of the ancient Greeks and Al-Razi, for example. We have this idea of another Hume, the philosopher David Hume, called it gentle usage. That there are ways that we can use animals, and that is not questioned. And I think that is very important, that there are ways that we are allowed to use animals, and that in which we can use animals without them coming to any harm that is sort of important. And then there are then a scale, and at some point it becomes wrong use. And I think it's very much the same as Al-Razi or David Hume from the 1600s. Any of these people say. So I don't think that it has changed very much. I think there might be a slight change in places in animal science academia. But in the public as such, I don't think so. Not that I can discern, no.
I only bring it up because I think of the 1800s and some of the ways animals were treated.
Mm.
For example, dogs being pressured to do certain tasks, or animals being beat. And like, I think that there's some sort of art that's the 4 stages of cruelty, showing the terrible things that were done to animals. And those were seen as everyday occurrences. And now that those would be completely unacceptable.
There are certainly, my old mentor, Bernard E. Rollin from Colorado State University, had this wonderful thing where he always said that he was driven by anger. And what he meant by this is that he's driven by all these things he sees, but he was also, like myself, an optimist about where it is going. So I agree with you that, or obviously I agree with you because it's fundamentally true that there are, for example, a great number of more laws protecting animals in certain concepts. In the Danish animal production system, 28,000 piglets die each day as a side effect of the production system, or probably a number of them under painful circumstances. So even though there are Denmark has some of the best, or at least some of the good on a worldwide basis, animal laws, and they would certainly stop dog fights or something like that. The laws do nothing for this type of immense misuse. So in one avenue, I'm kind of hopeful, optimistic, and when I then look down the other avenue, I think the people from the 1600s would come up and go like, how many piglets die every day as a side effect? And they'd be like, what are you guys doing? So I think there are sort of avenues where you can be very positive about the way that we are evolving our views of this, and in other ways we kind of seem to be either stuck or maybe even going a little bit the wrong way.
Thanks for that.
Yeah.
I have one question in the chat from Jean-Lou. Dear Jes, interesting history. At which stage would you say that animal welfare took importance for its own sake, and not as an indicator way to argue for virtues, such as towards fellow humans? Or can the two actually be together and not able to be disentangled?
Well, that's a very good question. So the answer is I have no idea, because it's happened many times. So many instances throughout the decades, even millennia, there have been people appointing animals as beings that are whose welfare is important because of themselves. Famously, some philosophers like Immanuel Kant said that animals were very important, but he was thinking about the stages of cruelty that you were talking about, Laura. You know, like if you misuse a dog, then you end up misusing humans, and that's bad. So you shouldn't misuse a dog. Or even, and this is much more interesting with Kant, if you misuse a dog, you are hurting yourself in some way. You are making yourself a worse person, and that's bad, but it's because of the human. But then you have people like David Hume, or you have people like Jeremy Bentham, and you have people like Al-Razi, and you have people like, and way back. In modern times, I think something really happened with Ruth Harrison's book, what's it called in English?
Animal Machines.
Animal Machines, it's called in English, and I think something happened there that kind, because and that is then in British context only, but I think something really truly happened with that. I think that is important for that, her bringing not just her own voice, but that type of voice into the conversation.
Yeah. And interesting that it came around the same time as the Rachel Carson silent
Yes.
spring.
So Carson actually, I don't know if you know that Carson actually wrote part of the foreword for Animal Machines. It was I would have loved to meet those women. That's some amazing women. So, yeah.
Yeah. So it looks like there's some questions from the audience. So Debbie, if you have a question, do you want to ask it?
Yeah, shall I start my video or just speak?
Whatever you're comfortable with.
Right, it says the host has stopped my video, so I'll just speak. So Jes, thanks for a super interesting talk, and I'm really envious to know that you had Bernard Rollin as your mentor.
Yeah.
I am one of those positivist behaviorists. And so my education in that sense was very all the sciencey science, as we call it. And for my PhD, I'm working in a phenomenological paradigm using ethnographic methods. So I wondered if you've come across people who are working in that way before, and if you have any helpful advice for me in disciplining the interdisciplinarity, as Bama would put it.
Yeah. Oh, that's a very good question. I wouldn't. So I don't think that this is so. If you are doing, if the work was phenomenological in any sense that I recognize, then I don't think it's the same as the positivism that I was kind of the Vienna Circle positivism.
Absolutely.
No, so it's not Pavlov. It's a hopeful, yeah. So I know she kind of sometimes divides the waters, but I have been very fond of both speaking with and having being spoken to by Françoise Wimmelsfelder, and then her and I have talked a number of times about the phenomenological aspects of trying to get across this, what Marianne Dawkins calls an explanatory gap. That is because we must also admit to ourselves that the reason that that behaviorist science can be so overwhelmingly positively taken into account out in the other scientific communities is that it is easier to explain. It's difficult to explain that we are interested in knowing about and perhaps even measuring states of existence that we do not have direct access to.
Yes, and states of experience in my research.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think when people do that, we have to talk about that as well. We can't just do it. I think we need to talk about this kind of explanatory gap. Last time I talked to Dawkins, this is many years ago, she had just kind of given up on it and like go, oh, we can't talk about it. But I've heard she kind of shifted in between. But I think it's important that we know that this type of world exists in ourselves, so that we have sort of access to that. So the assumption, we just have to assume and then go, if that assumption is true, if it's not just robots with 4 legs that we're talking about, then what can we know and how can we know it? And I think a phenomenological approach combined with types of behavioral science would be a wonderful thing. I would love to hear more about it, Debbie, if you'd like to send me an email afterwards.
Sure. Yes. Thanks. That's really encouraging. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to move to the chat box again. This is from Lindsay. This might be more towards semantics, but in the US, if someone says that they work in quote unquote animal welfare, the general public takes that to mean they work for an animal shelter. For instance, the Association for Animal Welfare Advancement focuses on animal shelters. For this reason, I'm always careful to say that I work in animal welfare science. Do you think this is a distinction that is common in most of the world or specific to the US?
Well, that is interesting. I have that is new to me too. That there is this distinction. I've lived in the U.S. a couple of times, working, for example, with Bernard Rollin, but also when I was very young, I was at Indiana University of Pennsylvania on a scholarship. So I've been to the US for a fair amount of time, and I've not come across this, but this is also interesting. And I think it's not just semantics, so to speak. I think it's very, very important that we understand, and I kind of did it when I said the Anglo-American bias, that the word animal welfare is an English word, right? So it's called something else in different languages. And by that tiny little shift in connotation and meaning in both language, but also in praxis, so that it is used differently or coupled with certain things, for example, certain ways of working animal welfare shelters, then it becomes something else. Right. So I think it's very important to be aware of these things, not just as I am not sure whether the idea about semantics was to kind of blow it off, but that this is actually what the type of creation and recreation, the evolution of a concept is part of. But again, sounds very interesting. I didn't know this.
Thank you for that. Hugh has their hand up. Do you want? Perfect.
Hi, Hugh.
Hi, Jes. Thanks for a wonderful talk, and thank you for the very kind words about UFAW. I wanted to go back a little bit further in history and just ask you how influential you actually thought Bentham was, because animal welfare scientists are very fond of quoting Bentham. It's hard to find anyone who doesn't have his quote at the start of their deck of slides, and we're clearly still asking his question about can they suffer, when we've very recently been thinking about whether crustaceans, for instance, are sentient. But do you think, was he influential at the time, or is it only recently that we've sort of picked up?
He was tremendously influential in his time, but not on the animal ethics thing. So I think the reason that all of you know about Jeremy Bentham is a man called Peter Singer. So I think all of us in a modern animal welfare science or animal welfare ethics arena, we know of Jeremy Bentham because the #1 animal ethicist in the world was a flaming Benthamite when he started writing about this. And still to this day is a very big fan of Bentham, as I am as well. And I think this is the reason that we are so aware of Jeremy Bentham's ideas today. We have to remember the very famous quote that we all sometimes encounter is a footnote. It's a footnote 200 and some pages into it. He's actually writing a chapter on slavery, and he kind of you see the light bulb going on up above his head and going like, wow, if it doesn't matter what color an entity, a being is, probably doesn't matter what kind of fur it has. So that it's a footnote. So it does. Of course, there are further places in his. One of the things that is exciting with Bentham is that we don't have all his writings published yet, because he was such a, like, he wrote things that he couldn't publish, things like that homosexuality might not be a bad thing and things like that, because of his utilitarian views. So there might be new things coming out that we can learn about Bentham today, but in his time he was very influential, but mainly on other matters. I think we should, if we want to think about the influence, we should probably look at the influence that people like Bentham and others like him, and he's not so. That's why I took my own Danish version of Jeremy Bentham, Frederik Alskov, because it was a typical view of many 1700s scholars, what Bentham said, and the influence of that scholarship into the first animal welfare NGOs, so the Royal Society of Protection Animals. Remember that they very quickly became the Royal Societies, the same in Denmark. And these were high society, well-educated people who, of course, also have contacted in the universities. So I think in that way, Bentham himself, not much, but the group of people, both in and outside of the country, thinking like him, had an influence. Was that a good enough answer? I don't know if I kind of ranted.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's maybe a common theme in a lot of animal welfare that concepts disappear for a long time and then are resurrected. I mean, the other one famously that UFAW was responsible for was the 3 Rs, and that sank without trace for not quite so long, but for 20 or 30 years until it was picked up by someone else.
Yeah. Oh, that's a very good example as well. I've thought about that a number of times as well. 3 Rs is a perfect example of that as well. Yeah. I'm looking at right now. I'm doing the same thing with the sustainability. The concept of sustainability. It's really interesting how that's been born, evolved, and kind of just been blown up so that it doesn't have any content anymore. Then it's been collected in different venues and stuff. So yeah, we can see that in many ways, and I think in our part of the world, we could pick up other concepts as well and have an eye for how they evolve and where they come from.
Oh, definitely. Thanks.
Just to give people another opportunity to raise their hand or type a question into the chat, I will ask one more question.
Yeah, please, Laura.
When you discussed the start of UFAW, you mentioned this strong desire to avoid soft-hearted idealists.
Yeah.
Do you think present-day animal welfare researchers should align with this value, or do you think that idealists might push the field forward?
That's a very good question. Okay, so I can answer that as a matter of tactic, and I can answer that as a matter of scientific rigorous approach or something like that. My real answer is that I don't know. What I do know is that we have always had this. So there are always there's this wonderful. Oh, wait a minute. I think I have the book somewhere here. So in Man and Beast, he writes about this, and he had this famous artist working for him called Fougas, who was like a cartoonist that worked together with Charles Wesley Hume. And in Man and Beast, he has this wonderful picture. I'm gonna show it to the camera. I'm hoping it's possible to see it like that. So these are two groups of animal welfare groups on a way to do battle against each other, right? So that was what he wanted to avoid, right? But he also wanted to avoid. They call them cranks. I don't think that's a good idea to call people cranks in any way. But what they wanted to avoid was basically deontologists, is what we would call it in my. They wanted to, and we in our context, perhaps more, we would call it abolitionists, or at least people who thought that animals did not just have the right to have their welfare counted, but that they had the right to freedom. That the right to themselves, the fundamental right to themselves. And I think that is the cracks in his book. And I think we should not do that. I think I really like, after reading about and his own words for very long, I really like Charles Wesley Hume. I wish I had met him. But I disagree very much with him. I think both for the science and for the welfare of animals and for anything that is true and good, we should not denigrate people who think who are deontologists, right-thinking animal rights as cranks. However, there are things that we want to do, improve animal welfare, and if we are told that well, you shouldn't, because we just have to stop it, the use at all, then you can't have both of these. So you have to choose one of those. In philosophy, sometimes we talk about ideal theory and non-ideal theory. So what would a perfect society look like? I've written articles about societies like Will Kymlicka. If anyone wants to read about this, they should read Zoopolis by Sue Donaldson and Will Kymlicka. That kind of picks up the thread and says, okay, animals are ethically relevant. Okay, then they are citizens of society. How do we make society? That is not a society we're going to see the next many years. So do we fight for that, or do we try and fix parts of the problem? I don't think there's a way we should choose between the two, but I think I I try to ride both horses, and we'll see how long it lasts. And not riding them hard, gentle.
Thank you for that. Jean-Lynn has a follow-up question. And what about animal welfare related concerns in other cultures that might be called differently from animal welfare, but relate to similar aspects or concerns?
So there's an enormous problem with my my presentation here, or not enormous. It's a normal problem. It's a cultural bias. It's a cultural relativism in a certain empirical and also philosophical sense. So a number of other cultures around the world have not only different words and concepts for animal welfare, they are simply understand animals in different ways, not necessarily better or more right ways, not necessarily more wrong or worse ways, but in different ways. For example, there are some cultures where animals are in a higher degree part of a communal thinking. There are cultures that have very, very strict differences between wild animals and agricultural animals, not just as how to use them, but as beings in the world. They're simply two different categories. So we have to be aware of these things in order to get our own thinking to become better. So I think one of the best ways to try and get better at thinking is trying to provocatively think differently. So I sometimes do a seminar with my students where they are supposed to defend tyranny. Right? They're supposed to defend tyranny, and they're all like, "What the? We don't want to defend tyranny. No, do it." And they're forced into a kind of thinking that they've never done before. And I think sometimes we should try, and I even do it things that are very intuitively against how I usually think. So people will, in the line of business I am, sometimes people come up to me and say that they can talk to animals, and I don't mean like, if any of you met or have read Birte Lindström's book called Asking Animals, it's not like that. No, they really mean that I have like long, conceptually heavy dialogues with animals, like Dr. Doolittle. And I meet these people, and I used to dismiss it as such. I still dismiss it as a concept, I think, but I engage them in the talk. I want to know what drives these people's thinking, even though I might not agree. And I think we need to do that with all types of thinking, and that is why we sometimes need to break out of the confines of typical academic Western culture. Not because we should go away from it. I think typical Western academic culture, university science, is one of the best things we have at all. But I think to get it even better, to get it to become even better, we should engage in discourses with people from other cultures who are thinking very differently.
And I think that is a beautiful place to end this conversation. Thank you, Jes, so much for your time today. It has been a pleasure to hear your talk. And yes, I wish everybody a good evening.